For over 44 months, Russia has waged war on Ukraine, and today we're again looking at the military situation there. I'm Julian Röpke, and this is Build Situation Room. We're back with the latest on the situation near the contested city of Pokrovsk in eastern Ukraine. Here, the bad weather over the past few days has caused both sides to slightly adjust their strategy, taking a somewhat different approach than they did in the days before. Generally speaking, they've ventured out of their hiding spots to directly attack the enemy due to the extremely bad weather and the opportunity to operate without encountering many enemy drones. We're first taking a look at the situation in Pokrovsk and have footage from the Russians that looks a bit like Mad Max or maybe even an ISIS army. So this is the Russian army advancing into Pokrovsk using the thick clouds and fog to their advantage. We see them advancing. All of this has also already been geolocated. Let's take a closer look. It's mainly motorcycles, civilian vehicles, and also vehicles modified by the Russians. As you can see here, these should to be proper infantry fighting vehicles like the ones in parades in Moscow. In reality, they're just Ladas or similar with doors removed with someone sitting on top. So this is the Russian army advancing into Pokrovsk specifically because of the extremely bad weather conditions. Before, as we remember, for months on end, you could only try to get in there with individual soldiers, lone infantrymen in small groups. Now Russia is making full use of the available opportunities to move into the city in considerably larger troop numbers overall. We can clearly see here that this has been carefully prepared well in advance. So we really shouldn't be misled into thinking it's a particularly advanced or modern army in certain aspects, when in fact in areas like drone warfare, it's very outdated or backward looking. When we look at the vehicles, simply due to the positioning, here we see a waiting drone essentially ready to take off from here if a Ukrainian approaches. Nonetheless, we'll see right away that this convoy was attacked as well. At least several of the vehicles were actually struck. Here we see it, and Ukrainian footage, and it's exactly the same road we just saw moments ago. Again, we see the problem. Despite the extremely bad weather conditions, they still managed to hit some of the motorcycles, setting them on fire with these drones. But hardly any infantry present, let alone any troops at all. That means we can reasonably assume that Russia, despite the adverse weather conditions, has managed to move hundreds of soldiers into Pokrovsk, right into the city itself, in order to push forward even further from there with the aim of capturing the last 10% of the city still under Ukrainian control. That continues to be the clear and determined Russian objective. And we're looking at another video showing how the bad weather is being exploited, this time by the Ukrainian side several kilometers north of Pokrovsk. Here we have a tank in Rodinske moving, and we can see it's exactly the same weather. We have this extremely dense fog, really low, and we reported a few weeks ago already that the Russians were in Rodinske. Then the Ukrainians had actually recaptured the town completely and even celebrated it for a while. But as we can see, the residential buildings, at least on the southern edge of the town, right there where it heads towards Pokrovsk, are back under Russian control. That's why we now see a Soviet-era tank belonging to the Ukrainian army here, slowly moving between these. Buildings driving carefully along between them and opening fire toward this position ahead, where Russian troops are believed to be located. So once again, what we're seeing here is we've got really bad weather, heavy fog, and Ukrainian forces possibly advancing with tanks toward the front lines. They usually don't dare do that because under normal circumstances, their tanks end up being targeted by Russian drones. And Rodinske, as we'll see right away on the map, is now about 2 or 3 kilometers from the nearest Russian drone position. So Russian fiber optic guided drones could actually swarm in here in large numbers and launch a direct attack on this tank right here. However, given the current weather conditions here, we clearly see an opportunity for the Ukrainians to move forward and to become active in Rodinske. We'll take a close look at both of these locations on the map and get a clear sense of where exactly this all took place. On one side, first of all, let's take a little extra time to carefully make our way in once more toward Pokrovsk in the Donetsk region. And here we see again what we saw last. The video, in fact, is from Rodinske. We can see it here. The orange is moving back into the town too. That means we assume the Russians have captured part of Rodinske. And we just spotted the Ukrainian tank over there a little while ago, right there on the second side. We had the situation where the Russians took control of this road and advanced steadily northward along it in full force. We just saw that moment where the Russian units were slowly moving along the road, and we can clearly see they're now attempting to move out from the south, from the red area down here where they're relatively safe, through Pokrovsk in order to advance further northward. And there are a few small villages between Pokrovsk and Molniya. I think you can see them here quite clearly. We can quickly zoom in a bit further to get a better look at that. These villages on one side are Hanativka, which the Russians announced yesterday, though the information is likely already 2 or 3 days old, about them having captured Hanativka and raised their flag there. However, the other 2 villages are extremely important. Those are Rivne and Svitle. These two villages are practically the only ones still remaining that continue to exist under Ukrainian control, located in the immediate vicinity surrounding the final remaining Ukrainian-held positions near Mirnohrad. That's why the Russians are currently attempting to push forward from both the northern and the southwestern directions in a bid to capture the settlements of Rivne and Svitla. Because if that succeeds, if these two small villages are captured, Mirnohrad, which we see here on the right, would still be 90% under Ukrainian control. With 41,000 people, it would be completely cut off. That's why it's not just the two major cities, but also the small villages in between that matter to the Russians. We have Novo-Ukrainka up there, and a bit further in this direction, roughly Lysivka, which is also currently contested. And exactly, we really mustn't overlook these villages when it comes to the broader overall battle for these two larger cities. From Hnativka, as already announced, fresh material again, clearly not from yesterday since we have much better weather here. We see the sun shining, we see the drone moving freely, and now we'll clearly see in further detail how this small village located just east of Pokrovsk was completely taken over by the Russians. That was actually already clear in recent weeks. It wasn't expected anymore that there would still be Ukrainian soldiers here. Nonetheless, it's now clear once again that means the completely destroyed village just east of Pokrovsk is now also under Russian control. And of course, it's kind of like a small demonstration by the Russians to show we've captured this area but haven't taken Pokrovsk yet. We remember in the center of the city we still saw the Ukrainian flag just recently from a few units that continue to hold their ground there. And so far the Russian flag still hasn't been raised in the center of Pokrovsk at any point whatsoever, let alone in the city of Mirnohrad. From the Donetsk region, we move several kilometers southwest into the Zaporizhia region. There we see more Russian territorial gains. We'll also look at videos from there, specifically from Nove, which was captured, and another village near Uspenivka. And yet again, we're now seeing these characteristic Russian footage of attacks, namely the extremely heavy bombardment targeting every suspected Ukrainian army position in Nove. And we've already reported in recent days that after the fall of Uspenivka, which was located by that small river, we'll see it on the map in a moment, by the Vovcha River, it now seems as though the doors are somewhat open for Russian advances toward the west. Because we simply have the situation confirmed on the map that the Russians have seized around 40 square kilometers here over the entire weekend, including having captured 3 additional settlements, and Ukraine currently appears to no longer maintain a fully stable and completely coherent frontline position in this area. We've just seen the attacks on that very position unfold over there. Here you can see it quite clearly once more. These are indeed Ukrainian positions that were carefully dug in over the course of many long months, where Ukrainian soldiers managed to hold on to this crucial advantage. However, after all these countless bombs have now fallen in this area over an extended period, after the last Ukrainians who had tried to put up resistance here were driven out or killed, the terrain now appears to be relatively open and clear in the Zaporizhia region, particularly in the eastern part of Zaporizhia, because right now in the stretch covering the next few kilometers ahead, we don't have any Ukrainian defensive positions in sight anymore. These are, as mentioned, recordings from Solotka, from now right next to Solotka. Let's just quickly take a look. Here too, it was the Russian forces who raised the flag, securing control over another village in the region. It's a relatively small village, but it does show the sheer number. Yesterday we had footage from Rubizhne, the day before that from Uspenovka. In other words, you can make relatively quick progress here, and now we can also take a closer look at this on the map of the region, where we can clearly see that there's a larger town located here. Huliapole is coming under growing danger, not just from the south and east, but now increasingly coming under threat from the north as well too, indeed. Let's take a look at the situation here. What we've just seen were the footage first from Nob, the second from Zolotki, and Rivnopilia is the last village that Ukrainian forces still hold here. After that, it's basically a straight path along this road. We're seeing this about 10 kilometers past Huliapole, a really important location for the Ukrainian army, which has been held for a very long time. And this entire area that I was just talking about is located right here. We can take a closer look at this. This particular area right here has actually been captured by the Russian army within just the last 3 to 4 days. So, as we can see, the Russians are advancing relatively quickly here. We still remember just a few months ago they were positioned here in the east at the border of the region. We see Donetsk, Dnipropetrovsk and Zaporizhzhia. The progress here is relatively slow so far, except for the last few weeks where they increased speed and reached the Vovcha. I think you can just about make it out here in a few places. And now they're able to continue advancing further westward in a relatively undisturbed manner and without encountering any solid Ukrainian defensive lines. At least that's how it currently appears. And this is what these Russian conquests, or so-called liberations as Russia calls them, actually look like, specifically a year and a half after the liberation. We can see it in the example of Avdiivka. There are newly released footage from the Russians showing exactly what the Russian world truly looks like. On the right side here you can see propaganda material claiming Avdiivka is now part of Russia. However, as we see the rest here, almost nobody lives here anymore. Avdiivka used to have 31,000 residents. It's estimated that there are currently about 1,000 left, mainly pro-Russian residents who simply stayed in the city and are now living under these miserable conditions. That means no water, no gas, no electricity, yet they still carry on living in what they call their own Russia, clinging to their identity. We can see Russian footage quite clearly here, and the Russian flag appears on the left, held by soldiers just wanting to show how things look on the ground right now. When you've brought a city fully under your control, meaning you've been holding it completely there since January 2024 throughout the entire area in Avdiivka at this point in time, and we can clearly see there are still a few houses where perhaps some apartments can still be lived in. Most of it, however, is completely destroyed due to the Russian attack, and this shows us exactly under what conditions most people in the occupied areas have to live. Of course, wherever Russia has the chance, wherever there's time, and where there are no more fights, like in Mariupol, further in the southeast, some rebuilding is happening. That doesn't need to be hidden at all. However, the vast majority of areas are left more or less exactly as we've just seen them. That means apart from these showcase projects like Mariupol, for example, Russia is hardly investing anything in rebuilding the occupied and allegedly Russian territories. We'll also take a look at this on the map and see Avdiivka, which, as mentioned, has been under Russian control since 2024, and the front line has indeed evolved quite a bit. Avdiivka, we see it here north of Donetsk, was held for a very long time by the Ukrainian army precisely in the hope that at some point they could launch that counteroffensive or the liberation of Donetsk city, which has been under Russian control since 2014. That didn't come true, and now the city's been under Russian control for about, well, we can see it, at least 60 kilometers behind the front line. And in certain areas, the front has even moved as far as up to 100 kilometers further in the northwest direction. And why the Russians are so successful in their advance isn't just due to their numerical superiority on the ground. It's not just air superiority with those over 100 kABS. I mean, those guided glide bombs that are launched during daylight hours, but it's also the specialized units operating the drones, which we keep having to discuss repeatedly. This here is the Rubicon unit, one of just two genuinely extremely elite units, one really has to say. And we're looking at a video here that one really just has to say was being released every 1 to 2 days or so. That's only about a third of what we're actually looking at here, and it's clear to see that Rubicon is easily capable of destroying around 20, 30, 40 Ukrainian vehicles per day, which is exactly what leads to that outcome. And we can see these aren't just some random recreational vehicles. This here is a Leopard 2 supplied from the West, probably not from Germany, but maybe from Poland or Spain. That means these are definitely modern, or indeed among the very latest major military vehicles that the Ukraine even dares to move anywhere near the front line, of which one simply has to admit as many as 90% ultimately end up being destroyed by Rubicon on one side and another Russian special unit we're now going to take a closer look at. On the other side, namely, the Russians have two units there that practically compete, constantly trying to prove who's the best, who kills the most Ukrainians, destroy the most Ukrainian equipment. One, as mentioned, is Rubicon, and the other one we're seeing right here in front of us now, called Suduplatov, and this unit is also active, not necessarily in the same Donbas region we've just seen, but this unit is now active here in Kharkiv. Now we can see here an M109 howitzer, a self-propelled artillery piece made in the USA, being attacked. It's hidden right here. And the Russians, or rather this specific unit, is now repeatedly deploying fiber optic guided drones, one after another, specifically to first destroy the protective cover. That means we've just seen the first drone fly in here and then create the very first small hole. Now the second one comes in aiming to widen that initial hole even further, so that eventually there's a real chance to fly right through these self-created openings in the defense and directly attack the turret itself with precision, force, and minimal risk. We're seeing more attacks. Russians succeed. Now we finally see what it's really about, this massive breach in the defensive line. And what's actually concealed behind it, namely the M109, being targeted over there. And we can see the Russians unfortunately don't lack drones at all. They're getting so much equipment, so much reinforcement from China, that they can easily keep flying in one after another from different angles until it finally catches fire. Here's another Bodana artillery piece, also fairly well hidden in the woods near Kharkiv. But this one was spotted too, likely due to the muzzle flash when firing. Each time generated was seen by a surveillance drone, and now we're seeing the attack here, exactly the same situation as before. So you keep flying back into the self-created gaps within these defense lines in order to ultimately strike and thereby inflict significant damage on the Ukrainians accordingly. And that's precisely the big problem for Ukraine. The Russians simply have enough material. They're getting an enormous amount of supplies from China to keep building new drones over and over again. Thousands are being deployed every day, and alongside all these infantrymen being sacrificed, they have these elite units competing fiercely with each other to who performs best in Ukraine, who builds the most advanced drones, who has the most shoot-downs, and so on. And so Ukraine faces a major problem because these units are in fact extremely strong, keep getting reinforced, and are effectively trying to prove to Kremlin leader Vladimir Putin that they are the most effective ones. And it's not just Rubicon and Sudoplatov active against the Russians, but of course there are other units operating with different drones as well. We've just seen that these two units primarily use quadcopters, so they mainly deploy fiber optic guided and radio guided quadcopters for attacks. Other units make use of larger drones, specifically fixed wing types such as the Molniya, for instance, to carry out their missions. And here we see an extraordinary attack by one of these Molniya drones. You can see it here on the left. That's the drone on approach. On the right, we have a Ukrainian trench position that's already quite battered, meaning it's been hit many times before and shows heavy damage. Now we can see how the drone enters the trench position. Interestingly, it appears to be carrying incendiary or phosphorus-based ordnance. We can see that this explosion here is really quite extraordinary, reminiscent of bomb attacks previously seen in other conflict zones. And based on this massive explosion, we can clearly say that some kind of magnesium or phosphorus or another incendiary mixture was used here to attack the Ukrainian position and the soldiers inside, and if possible, to burn them. That makes it even more important to shoot down these drones. And here we see a new video from the Ukrainian army showing exactly how many of these Molniya drones are in use and how many are still being shot down before they hit their target position. I think 11 are shot down here alone, each one successfully taken out by interceptor drones. But this entire situation clearly illustrates just how many are being deployed and how absolutely vital it is for the Ukrainians to intercept as many as possible, because each impact likely costs lives. But the Ukrainian army isn't staying idle either when it comes to using its own drones against enemy equipment. Now we're seeing a video showing the coordinated use of reconnaissance drones, specifically the Shark model on one hand, but also an HF-1 drone from Germany supplied by the company Helsing, as well as FPV kamikaze drones being deployed. Aimed at destroying a target here, first we're seeing the real-time footage captured by the surveillance drone of the Shark type, which here spots a Russian BM-21 Grad rocket launcher in action. That means we can see directly the Grad launcher is positioned here, firing rockets up to 20 kilometers away in this direction, but the Shark's range is significantly greater. It sees everything going on here right now, immediately starts tracking the vehicle, carefully observes it trying to retreat back to its base, and now relays this information to other units. And now we can see it quite clearly here how the target is being marked. And then an HF-1 drone. Here we can clearly see the approach, a drone delivered from Germany that is now being used in active operations. We can clearly see this is an AI-powered drone with the target securely locked and tracked. We can clearly see the deviation there. And here again, the whole thing shows the target is basically logged in, so to speak. The last mile, roughly around a kilometer, sometimes just a bit more. Can we then rely on AI here and target the destination without a pilot? Now we can see the impact of the first drone, but it was clearly not sufficient, which is why the Ukrainians are now launching additional drones into action. Specifically small FPV drones, meaning quadcopters, quite a few of which actually hit here. And in the end managed to take out this rocket launcher, or to be more specific, multiple rocket launcher of the Russian army, about 20 kilometers behind the front line. Finally, let's take a moment to have a look at a newly released video from the city of Tuapse, the Black Sea port of the Russian Federation. And this one was attacked once again yesterday, most likely through the use of a swim drone. We'll take a look at the footage. There are new recordings from the harbor that show us how most likely an oil tanker, probably a sanctioned one, tried to export Russian oil and gas, gets hit here by this floating drone. We're now witnessing the massive explosion that has been triggered right here by the impact caused by the Ukrainian drone strike. Here we see it, sailed several hundred kilometers inland, as we'll show on the map in a moment, and now hits one of the ships here. And that causes the explosion. We're showing it very briefly here with live footage coming directly from the harbor area right now. However, there are numerous eyewitnesses who also filmed the whole thing from the city. We usually have the situation beforehand that the Russians try to intercept the whole thing with warships, that they actually shoot at it. And so in this case, it has now actually succeeded effectively hitting it from the Ukrainian side. We already had several different recordings yesterday that clearly show something burning there. We didn't yet know exactly what it was. The first recordings showed us actually something really did hit here. And it has once again struck the oil terminal, or one of the tankers at the facility that was in the process of being loaded to export Russian oil and gas to international markets. We'll take another look at the map right now to get a clear idea of where exactly Tuapse is situated. And we can clearly see that the Ukrainian floating drones must cover an extremely long distance just to reach that location. Because the whole of the Sea of Azov is completely under Russian control from every single side, Tuapse, as we can clearly see down there with the explosion symbol, is still only accessible from southwestern Ukraine. That means we can assume the drones, the floating drones, that swam or traveled there in order to carry out the attack must have covered at least 1,000 kilometers. And of course, that's a considerably long distance, requiring substantial strategic and logistical effort to cover. Nevertheless, it's important to the Ukrainians to at least deliver some targeted pinpricks against Russia's fuel, oil, and gas industry. And in that sense, this is yet another attack that is specifically meant to at least attempt the sanctions initiated by the West, which aren't actually being implemented, to be physically enforced accordingly by the Ukrainian side as well.